Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on absence management and specifically how to deal with mental health absences. First of all, some introductions. Our main presenter today is Victoria Templeton, who many of you will know now, one of our HR knowledge managers, and I'm here as well to support with any technical queries or questions that you may have during the webinar. We do want to encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. We have had to put you all on mute. There are hundreds of you attending today, so it would be pretty impractical to leave it all open. However, we will take questions. If you use your panel, which should look something like this, post your question in there. I will then collate them and we will field them at the end of the webinar. We will be asking or putting some polls up during the webinar to help make it as interactive as possible, like we do at our normal events. It'll appear on your screen like this. To be able to participate, ensure your screen is not in full screen mode when you come to vote. Otherwise, it won't let you actually submit your choice. So I'm now going to hand over to Victoria, who's going to take us through the webinar.
Thank you very much, Sue, and welcome everybody to our webinar this morning. So I'll just set the screen up, if you just bear with me. There we go. Let's see if this is now working. Sorry about that. Brilliant. Okay, so thank you everybody and welcome to our webinar this morning, all to do with mental ill health and how we can manage it in the workplace. So I just want to run through the agenda, and I'll begin with putting some context around the topic today by considering what is mental health, what are the causes and consequences of it, and then I'll move on to look at our moral and legal obligations and how you can balance those within the context of employment law and specifically the Equality Act. Before I then talk through the practical aspects, considering what is reasonable and how we can manage. And then towards the end, we have some useful links that you may find helpful, and we'll be taking questions from you all this morning. So before we actually get stuck in with the webinar, we're just going to run a few quick polls. So I'd just like to ask Sue to open the polls for us. If you could just make sure you're not in full screen mode, that would be really brilliant, and it'll help you participate if you wish.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. So I'm going to launch the first one, which is, have you seen an increase in mental health absences in the workplace over the last year? Just a simple yes or no answer. Just let that for a couple of seconds.
Okay.
It's like most people have voted now.
Okay.
A few more just coming through. Okay, I'm going to close that poll and share the results with you. So there we've got 79% yes.
Yeah, okay.
That's perhaps unsurprising, but
Absolutely.
yeah. Okay, let me hide that one. And shall we ask the next one? So do you feel comfortable in supporting an employee with mental health? Okay, that one's changing by the minute, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to close that poll and share the results with you. So we have 60% who do, but still quite a significant number who don't. Okay, and let's hide that one and load the next one, which is, Do you believe you have the right systems and processes in place to support employees with poor mental health?
This is interesting.
Yeah, this is a close one. Okay, so I'll close that one.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a very interesting statistic.
Mm,
It's almost 50-50 really, isn't it?
yeah.
Okay, we've got one more poll in this section. Let me just load the last one. And you can, this one is a multiple choice, so you can tick as many as are appropriate. So what do you find difficult in respect of managing mental health at work? Nearly there with this one.
Okay. Yeah. I probably expected that.
Yeah. Okay, I'll close that and share the results with you. So there we go. The significant majority is saying we're doing the wrong thing.
And I can understand that.
Yeah, that's in my experience, that is the biggest fear. Having to use formal absence procedures, knowing what support I can give, and seeking consent is also up there.
Okay.
Seeking consent can be a challenge, can't it? Especially
Mm,
in these circumstances. So yeah, I'll
thank you for that.
close that poll and hand over to you to take us through.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. And thank you everybody for those responses. So I'm going to start looking now at what mental health is. And we have a definition from the World Health Organization, and they say health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. It's a state of well-being in which an individual realizes their own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to their community. And then we have the Health and Safety Executive. Now they define mental health at work as being work-related stress, depression or anxiety that is harmful reaction people have to undue pressures and demands placed upon them at work. Now there are many different forms of mental health disorders. Each of them are obviously very serious and will affect individuals to different extents. Many will hold similar symptoms, but they are all very unique and have their own characteristics. So as you can see, and this won't be the whole list. So, you know, there are many different forms of mental health that we can see. In terms of causes and consequences, well, there's many causes of mental ill health, as you can see from the list here. So it can be personal life and relationships, money, work-life changes, health issues, and the pandemic as well. And obviously, going back to that poll, we've seen, you know, an increase by, 70% in our workplaces over the last year. And of course, traumatic life events. These are all things that can be the causes of mental ill health. And we know that mental health can lead to poor physical health, and that can include high blood pressure, heart disease, sleeping disorders, and general lower immune systems. But it can also lead to absenteeism, as we see higher sickness absence levels, and these can either be short-term intermittent or long-term ill health. And of course, for those who remain in work, then mental ill health can impact work performance. You'll see a reduction in productivity, perhaps increased errors in their work, poor decision making, procrastination, and even a deterioration in how they approach their planning and control of their work. And we can also see it impacts on somebody's attitude and behaviours at work. So you might see somebody's loss in motivation, their commitment, or even poor timekeeping. Or we've seen, we can see the opposite of, excessive increased working hours. So these are all sort of consequences of mental ill health. And of course, it can impact on relationships. So in the context of the workplace, then you might find workplace conflict arises. that there may be tensions between colleagues or even poor relations with customers, as well as disciplinary problems. Now, we have evidence in terms of the extent of mental ill health for people and businesses. So according to the World Health Organization, depression is a leading cause of disability worldwide, and that's significant for me. And what's more is that globally more than 264 million people of all ages suffer from depression, and more women are affected by depression than men, for example. And according to Mind, 1 in 4 people will experience mental ill health in England each year, and 1 in 6 people report experiencing a common mental health problem such as depression or anxiety in any given week in England. Now, these statistics are significant, and of course they are general, but what about how mental health can impact on the workplace? So if we look at the Health and Safety Executive and a report that came out in 2019-20, in this report, it identified that 828,000 workers suffered from work-related stress, depression or anxiety. And that amounted to 17.9 million working days lost due to work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. And of all work-related ill health, 51% was attributed to the mental ill health, such as depression, anxiety. And 55% of those working days that were lost were due to depression or anxiety. And the findings found that these statistics, the workload was the prominent cause of the high levels of absenteeism, you know, whether it was tight deadlines, too much work pressures, but they were the workload was the prominent cause. So it's really quite staggering the extent to which it can affect people. But we'll look at the moral obligations for employers, because apart from the legal obligation, we want to support those people with poor mental ill health because it is the right thing to do. So how you manage mental health, whether that's managing an absence from work or whether you're managing the employee who remains in the workplace, it's really important to treat others with dignity and respect through your company's systems and processes, whilst also having that awareness, that sensitivity and empathy towards the employee and their health. Organisations should have a zero tolerance of bullying, harassment and discrimination towards those who suffer with mental ill health. And finally, it's realising, as we've seen in those statistics, that it actually is more common than we think. And so when it comes to managing mental health at work, from a moral perspective, I would always say treat someone just as how you would like to be treated, and by doing so you can't go far wrong. That'll ultimately help you in your approach in supporting them moving forward and being able to deal with it sensitively. But of course, managing ill health, mental ill health, it is going to be a balancing act. So from an absence management perspective and how to deal with mental health in general, there will be a balance to be sought between the needs of the organisation and the needs of the employee. As this illustration is showing, you've got on the one hand your business needs, because you need to continue to respond to COVID, you need to respond to other external challenges, whilst continuing to make sure that you're running a profitable business. But at the same time, it's necessary to ensure you maintain that duty of care that you owe towards the employee and look after your employees. And this is for legal and moral reasons. Each business is going to be different in terms of their context. So what's going to be reasonable to one in terms of support may not be reasonable to another. And we'll come on to that shortly. So the important piece of legislation around managing mental ill health predominantly is your Equality Act. But before I go into that specifically, I do want to just share with you other relevant pieces of employment legislation, because having an understanding of this will help protect your organisation, because it will enable you to make those decisions within the law and therefore hopefully avoiding employment tribunals. So the Equality Act, as I said, is a piece of legislation. It's the main one, I would say, and it prohibits discrimination. If we think about mental health, then in some cases mental health disorders can be considered a disability for the purpose of the Equality Act. You then have the Employment Rights Act of '96, which is a wide-ranging piece of employment legislation and key for employing staff. And so it does deal with ensuring employees have protection against suffering a detriment during their employment. It protects them from not being unfairly dismissed, and it offers them protection from being dismissed, selected for redundancy, or from being made subject to a detriment when making protected disclosures, also known as whistleblowing. And also there is protection against not being constructively dismissed, and that's when an employee is forced to resign in consequences of a fundamental breach of the contract. We then, of course, have the Data Protection Act of 2018 and the UK GDPR. And these are really important in absence management in general, as you are handling sensitive personal data, and a vital step in managing absence that's connecting to mental ill health or any type of absence. Then it's about seeking mental access to somebody's medical records. And of course, you've got the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. These are both vital in managing the employment relationship. In terms of claims, then in general, as with absence management, then you've got potential for claims of discrimination, constructive unfair dismissal, and personal injury claims, which go through a different court to an employment tribunal. Now, if we specifically focus on the Equality Act, as I said, this is perhaps the main piece in connection with how you manage day-to-day mental ill health in the workplace. The Equality Act legislation can cover mental health disorders. Now, the Act defines a person to have a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. These highlighted words are important because it's against these elements that a judgment is made as to whether the medical condition is to be covered by the Act or not. Now, ultimately, it's going to be for a tribunal to judge whether that health issue at the centre of the case is a disability. However, employers should still give serious consideration to whether their employees' health issue does fall under the Act or not, because that's important for how you manage the case. So we know that, first of all, a medical condition can either be physical or mental, as I've just read out in that definition. They can both be covered by the Equality Act. Secondly, we must gauge how substantial the effects of the condition are on the person. So it must be more than a minor effect, and then it makes it more difficult for somebody to do something. This information generally would be obtained through your discussions, evidence through your discussions with the employee, as well as evidence in the form of medical reports, whether that's from a GP, specialist, or occupational health. And depending on the case and the circumstances, you might find that you need to seek more than one piece of medical advice, and that might be reasonable on managing the case. And thirdly, it's about considering how long-term the health condition is likely to be. And under the legislation, it means that it's something that has affected the person or likely to affect the person for at least a year, 12 months. What's important to note that if you're looking at mental health, then if somebody has episodes just lasting for a few weeks or perhaps a couple of months at a time, and then they have episodes where they're okay and they're back at work, then their condition could still be a disability, even though they've individually those episodes aren't your 12 months. If they've collectively, and you look back over their history, it could mean that their health condition is covered by the Act. And finally, what is meant by normal activities are those things such as going to work, shopping, getting dressed. So being able to understand and explore the nature of your employee's health in this context will be important for you to ascertain to what extent your legal obligations are. Now, under the Equality Act, there is a disability. In terms of the Equality Act, mental ill health can be a disability, and if it is, then in terms of your obligations, then it's about complying with the duty to make reasonable adjustments and the responsibility to not discriminate because of the disability. Now, I'll come on shortly to talk about reasonable adjustments further. But in terms of discrimination because of the disability, you've got many forms. You've got direct discrimination, and that's where somebody's treated worse than another person in a similar situation, and it's directly because of their disability. or for the purpose of the webinar, mental health. Indirect is when a company has a particular policy or way of working there's a worse impact on those with disabilities compared to those who don't. And then you can have discrimination arising from a disability, which protects workers from being treated badly because of something connected to the disability, such as needing time off for medical appointments. And then you have harassment and victimization. So harassment is when somebody treats somebody in a way that makes them feel humiliated, offended or degraded, and they believe it's because of their disability. And victimization, when somebody is treated badly because they've made a complaint of discrimination under the Equality Act. And just finally, I just wanted to highlight some statistics. So if we look back for the 2019-20 year, the official statistics from the Employment Tribunal services, when you look at disability claims, now I don't know, this isn't drilling down on the type of disability, it's just disability in general. The average award that was made was £27,043. The median award was £13,000 and the maximum award was £265,719. So the implications are significant, and with any discrimination claim, they're not capped. So I just wanted to share that with you. But we're now going to focus on what is reasonable, because understanding this will then help you in managing the mental ill health in the workplace. So I said earlier that each business will be different. So what's reasonable to one may not be to another. And of course, we've got to be mindful that somebody's mental ill health disorder could be a disability. And where that is the case, then it's about the legal obligation to introduce reasonable adjustments. An employment tribunal will consider several factors in determining what's reasonable for an employer to do, and that will be things like the size of the business, the financial resources, and the administrative setup. So when you're working with somebody, supporting them, it's important to consider, when you're trying to work out whether implementing something is going to be reasonable or not to the business, then consider things like the extent to which that adjustment would ease the disadvantage suffered by the individual compared to a non-disabled individual, the practicality and the cost of making those adjustments, and the extent to which the adjustment would disrupt the organisation's activities. And then also bear in mind the financial and other resources available to the business, and the availability of external financial or other assistance, such as, you have the return to work, access to work scheme that's in place, and also the nature and size of the employer's business. So these are some of the pointers that are really important to consider when you're trying to work out what's going to be reasonable or not. And it can be very difficult, but it's trying to think logically and systematically and work through that methodical approach. So here we're looking at some examples of what may be reasonable adjustments. And reasonable adjustments can be anything to do with the job role, the working environment, the hours of work. So if we talk about the working hours, then that can be not just the number of hours worked, but it could be the schedule of the hours worked. So for example, if somebody's on medication to help with their disorder, it perhaps might make them groggy in the mornings, then are you able to reasonably adjust their start time? So by the time they come into work to start, that grogginess is perhaps eased off, and they're able to go to work and perform with no side effects of that medication. So there's things like that that you can consider. Then it's things like offering periods of unpaid leave. They might need a period of time out of the business to help with their managing of their mental health. You could, from a workplace perspective, set up dedicated quiet areas to allow hot desking. So if somebody is perhaps feeling stressed or there's a bit of pressure going on, then that's probably an avenue that may help. And time out of the workplace to attend counselling relating to mental health. And of course, from a line management perspective, finding ways in which you can support with managing workload. And when it comes to your company procedures, you can consider actually adjusting your absence triggers. So and obviously you need your medical evidence to help in this decision making, but there is an argument that somebody that has a disability is more likely to have sickness absence than somebody that doesn't. And therefore, it could be appropriate and reasonable to adjust that absence trigger system that's in place that you would use when you need to know when a formal absence meeting is triggered. That way, somebody with a disability does not fast track through your company processes really quickly because of the mental health. And obviously, you know, the very last course of action of any of the, you know, those formal processes will be a dismissal. And obviously you don't want somebody to fast track through that approach. So think about how you may be required to adjust your absence triggers. And then also there's things like your job redesign and redeployment, obviously through agreement, as you can't unilaterally change somebody's terms and conditions, but it may be that a adjustment to their role or finding a suitable other role may be appropriate. And as I say, it's about what's reasonable for the business, taking on board those pointers I've just gone through. And if something was to be put in place to the detriment of the business, and you obviously therefore can't implement it, then you need to be prepared to explain and demonstrate your decision making and how you've got to that decision, because if you're ever having to defend your actions in a tribunal and justify your approach, then you can do so. So if we now look at the practical side of managing mental health, supporting and managing mental health in workplace can require both informal and formal approaches. And you'll find that some of the actions that are undertaken in either, and that I'm going to talk through, can be used at any stage, and they can also be repeated. So you wouldn't necessarily just have one medical report from 3 years ago and that be it. There will sometimes be a need to repeat certain actions. So if we look at supporting mental health informally first, you know, here are some things that I would recommend. And the most important thing for any line manager who's made aware of an employee's poor mental health is to not ignore it. It takes a lot of courage for somebody to speak up and share how they're feeling, and there's a lot of stigma still attached, even though we know depression is the world's leading cause of disability. And whilst we're not medical experts, and it may be difficult to have those conversations, but the person raising it and letting you know, they're doing it for a reason. They're crying out for help. They need support. As I say, so whilst we're not medical experts, we can do our bit to signpost and encourage professional support so they can seek that help. But there will also be things that you, from a workplace perspective, are in control of and can help put in place or carry out to help. But it's certainly something that you know, we should not ignore. The second thing is, or the third thing is around actually dealing with issues promptly. You don't want people to be festering and letting things sort of play on their minds. You know, deal with it promptly, and that will all be part and parcel of managing their well-being and support in the workplace. Now consider having an employee assistance programme. Some of you may have them in place, not all, but these are employee assistance programmes known as EAPs. They are confidential services by an external provider that offer counselling and guidance to employees, usually almost on any topic, and tend to be 24/7. They are entirely confidential, so for the employee it's really helpful because it allows them to offload or ask questions of somebody that's entirely independent and not biased in any way to their situation. Employees don't get the specific feedback from the provider about why people have used it, but they may obviously get feedback in terms of usage levels, but that's pretty much it. Then there's mental health first aiders, and we're hearing more and more about these and the importance of the role they play. Now they are a point of contact for anyone experiencing mental health problems. They can identify signs and symptoms of mental ill health, and they can start supportive conversations and know what language and questions to use. They listen non-judgmentally and can provide reassurance whilst also assessing the risk of self-harm and if that person is in danger to themselves. So if you don't have any mental first aiders in the workplace, then I would really recommend looking at whether you can explore having that role in place. Line management training on managing mental health is also important. We don't expect managers to be experts and medical professionals, as I've said, but it's more about knowing how to support somebody through company procedures, giving them access to tools and when to direct them to medical professionals. And a really important part of day-to-day line manager is your one-to-one process. That's your opportunity to check in with them, find out how they're doing, and if you need to offer any extra support or tweak any of the existing support that you may have put in place. And another important management tool is your return to work interview. We know from research that actually your return to work interview is seen as a major tool for keeping absence levels down. And so those people who are returning to work following a mental health episode, then your return to work discussion helps facilitate those conversations between the manager and employee, so it can help to ascertain, really, are they fit to be back at work? What support do they need for returning? And what other actions can you look at implementing that may be needed, which may be things like your occupational health, for example. So those two management tools are essential for managing mental health in the workplace. And whether you have a wellness action plan in place, that will depend on your situation. A wellness action plan is something that helps people manage their mental health. It's a personalised tool that can help identify what keeps a person well at work, what causes the employee to become unwell, and how to address it should they experience any episode. And so it's enabling that dialogue to commence between the employee and the manager so that they can better understand their needs and experiences and ultimately support the mental health. You then have access to the health and safety executives management standards, so they're readily available online, and those standards are about how you can look at the individual's mental health. So if they're feeling a period of stress, well, is it to do with the demands, and if so, what steps do you need to be putting in place to help manage the demands of the role? Is it to do with the control, or is it to do with the support that they have or perhaps don't have in the workplace? Is it a relationship challenge that's going on in the workplace that's contributing to stress, or is it the role and what you need to change to support that? So the health and safety management standards are particularly important to refer to when you're managing episodes of, in particular, stress-related mental ill health. And then, of course, the stress risk assessment, and that's really important to make sure you're managing the risks in the workplace connected to episodes of mental ill health connected to stress. You can set up dedicated quiet spaces, like I've mentioned, so employees have a go-to area to concentrate and work, allowing them to focus on the job in hand without distraction. And you can provide access to meditation apps and other online resources. You might want to look at offering a suite of tools and information resources for employees that they can go to access. And having supportive conversations, you know, these are always going to be really important, and sometimes it's really difficult to know what to say or how to say it, but being mindful of the nature of the health is important, because you will need to adapt your approach, including the style of your communication. And seek medical guidance. So I've touched on this previously. So it's about seeking that medical advice from either an occupational health provider, writing to their GP, or if they're under a care of a specialist, then seek their input in how you can better understand their medical history in regards to the mental health disorder. You know, we aren't medical experts, as I keep mentioning, and we have to rely on, to some extent, medical information to help us with our decision making. And it will also help us to determine, do we think the health is going to be covered by the equality or not. So it's really important as part of absence management, and it can be either through an informal process or when you're managing it more formally, they can come at any stage, but it's really important to seek medical guidance. And something I touched on earlier as well is, you know, don't use out-of-date information. If it's been 3 years since you've had a medical report, well, refresh that and get another one. And then a really important thing for you is for you to seek help and support yourself. You know, it can be difficult. It's hard having conversations and seeing people struggle. But if you do have an EAP in place, then you can use that. You can get that guidance and support. But just take care of yourself as well. And if you're going into any conversation with your employee and you feel a little bit nervous or unsure, then do your research in advance. Read up on reputable guidance documents and websites. So we know the NHS, they have a huge amount of information to do with mental health conditions, or the charity Mind will have reference materials. So just make sure it's reputable websites that you're going to, and of course the health and safety execs. So having a little bit of insight into the disorder, the condition, will help you in approach your conversation or meeting. So now we're going to move on to looking at supporting managing mental health, but more on a formal basis. And this can be very difficult because it's very hard, because if you see somebody struggling or has been struggling with it, and then you've got to use a policy, it feels a little bit difficult. But it is really important. And I know I do get that people don't want to feel like they're adding to the person's struggles or making the situation worse. Or, you know, what if you say the wrong thing? Or what if you know the person outside of work and are friends outside of work, or you don't know what the words to use in that conversation? It is really tricky. But if we think back to that balancing act, on the one hand, we must support employees, and on the other hand, we must also continue to support the business and manage the level of absenteeism, because too much will become detrimental. So as with any absence, you are entitled to address mental health absences and your usual sickness processes. It can even be a potentially fair dismissal should it lead to a long-term absence where a return is not possible, or where there continues to be sporadic periods of short-term intermittent absences that are exceeding trigger systems. Although clearly this should be absolutely the very last course of action, and after all other reasonable options have been explored. But nonetheless, it's important to be mindful of that is potentially an avenue. So if you are at the point of needing to address mental health absences more formally, either because their absence record for short-term absences or they're on long-term sick, here are some sort of points I want to just talk through. So the first thing to remember is that the aim of any process is to improve attendance. It's about getting them back to work. That must be your ultimate gain, aim, and objective of the processes. It's not about punishment. It's not trying to reprimand them for having a bad absence record. It's about trying to improve that attendance. Not only is it good for them and their well-being to be back at work doing normal activities, but it's also obviously good for the business. You're also entitled to introduce a short and long-term absence procedures to deal with the level of absence. It's important that you act consistently, and this is why everybody should be under, you know, the same procedures. You know, they don't apply to some people in the organisation and not others. You have to act consistently, because it's important to do so, because it means that you're reducing the risk of treating people differently, and therefore discrimination can be avoided, or even unfair dismissal claims. So it's really important that you act consistently. However, you can and should adapt those procedures to take account of any potential mental health condition. And so this can include, as I've said, adjusting the absence triggers, because as I said, we don't want people fast tracking through a process just because of their disability. When you have somebody that doesn't have a disability that doesn't get fast tracked, that's not fair. So it's about recognizing when to adapt the absence triggers. You can also look at extending the right to be accompanied in that meeting to allow the employee to bring a supporter. And that person can act as a go-to between the employee and the manager. It can help ease communication between the employee and the manager. And it's particularly helpful in rewording any unclear questions and help the employee in their understanding of those questions. So it is particularly helpful, and especially if where the employee cannot deal with stress or too much pressure, having somebody of support there can be supportive. And if their condition was covered by the Disability Act, then it very well could be a reasonable adjustment by extending your normal processes. So think about how you can adapt your procedures to take account of their health. And finally, the meeting location. So, we often see with long-term sick cases in particular, they can take place at the employee's home, assuming, they're happy and comfortable with that, or at a neutral location or in the workplace. So think about how you can adjust the meeting location to make it as supportive a process as possible for that employee. And if you need to seek medical advice, actually, in terms of carrying out that meeting, do so. And it may be that perhaps the advice is put it on hold for a few weeks until they're in a better position. But just think about how you can adjust your processes. Also, when managing mental health formally, it's about seeking that medical advice. And I know I've touched on it, and it can come in at any stage. It can come in at the informal, normal day-to-day line management, or it can come through as an activity as part of a formal absence meeting. So do use their GP, the specialists, or even occupational health. And as I said, make sure the reports that you're using are up to date and accurate. And certainly if you're at the very end of your process where you feel you've exhausted almost all options, then certainly medical evidence must be received before any decision to take is taken on their continued employment. I've also spoken as well about how researching their mental health condition in advance of going into that formal meeting from your reputable sources, that helps you just prepare and perhaps helps focus some of your questions and what questions to ask. Remember the potential for adjustments. They could be a legal requirement, so just have that in the back of your mind. And if your organisation has benefits in place, such as income protection schemes, so if somebody's off for a period of time, they may be eligible, don't forget to make them aware and remind them about it, especially if it's a contractual scheme. You've got obligations to make sure your employee has access to all your benefits that you offer. And redeployment, that could be an option in terms of needing to manage their absence formally, and it could be a way of avoiding dismissal. As I said, dismissal in theory, is your very last course of action. Everything must be exhausted fully before you get to that decision, and actually redeployment could be that. But remember, you're not legally obliged to create a role, but if there is a role that they can move into, then certainly explore that with them. And we're coming towards the end, and this is more about how you adapt your approach with managing mental health in general. And it is about having that careful, supportive approach that is necessary. The style of communication that you have, being particularly careful with the choice of words you use and the tone you use is really important. Whilst you don't want to be tiptoeing around people, because sometimes they do need the clarity, but it's thinking about how you phrase things. And how you position discussions is important, because your employee needs to know that the purpose and the aim of those conversations are about their well-being. It's about trying to improve their attendance, trying to get them back into work, helping them find some actions. It should be all positive. So be mindful of that. Try not to put it across in a way that employees feel like they're being punished for it, or that they're having to be sanctioned with warnings for their absence. It's more about trying to strike that balancing act as well if you're in a formal process. And their absences are genuine and serious, and sometimes employees can feel that going through formal processes, it's because the employer doesn't think it's genuine. Well, it's not like that at all. It's simply, if we think about the balancing act, too much absence from work is a detriment to the business. And so it's trying to strike that balance. And so it's nothing to do with questioning the genuineness and seriousness of their ill health. And honesty and transparency are key. If they're treated sympathetically, openly, and treated like adults, then they do understand, and they're trying to that you're trying to run your business. Being honest and open is really important. And like I said, you can't tiptoe around conversations of certain subjects. They are you are obliged to inform them of the long-term implications of continued poor attendance or continued long-term absence, because ultimately the consequences could mean bring their employment to the end. But when you get that late stage in a process, you have to be direct and let them know the implications. And whilst you can support a certain amount of absence levels, there's a point where it does affect the business. But as I say, that's really at the last course of action, when you've exhausted and put in place the support that I've talked through in these slides that we've just gone through. And what we'll do before I share some useful links, I'm going to open up a couple of polls. So Sue, if I can ask you to kindly open the first poll for us.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of reflective polls for you based on what you've now heard. So the first one I'm going to launch is, do you now feel more comfortable in supporting an employee with mental health? Have we given you any food for thought, basically? But it is a very tricky area to manage, isn't it?
It is. It's really hard, and it's very hard.
Okay, let's close that poll and share the results. That's encouraging.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, that's really good to hear.
93% of you feel that you do feel a bit more comfortable in supporting your staff now. So let's ask another one, which is, now you've reflected on it and following this guidance, do you think you do have the right systems and processes in place to support your staff with poor mental health? Or do you think you need to do more? Okay, let's close that poll and share the results. So yeah, I think we've had an increase on the previous statistics on that one.
Okay. Yeah.
So
that's good.
Yeah, good. So that you do, it's an understanding, isn't it, of what you can do. So therefore, if you understand what is possible and that you can actually manage it, it's not that you have to kind of shy away and park it until they reckon they're fit to come back. You can actually do things to support your employee and hopefully get them back to work sooner.
Yeah, and I think there is that, it is tricky because you don't want to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. But if you've got those right systems in place, the right processes in place, they apply to us all, everybody. It's adapting your style, your communication and your approach, and just remember that you may need to put in extra support for some people based on their circumstances. Each case is going to be different as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's the last poll, so I'll move on to some useful links here. So, as they indicate, they're all recognised useful links that feel free to obviously access and share on with your employees. I mean, like I said on one of the slides, if somebody is coming to you, it's about acting on it and listening to them and recognising. It can be a fine line, can't it, between your role as line manager and where that line is, and just recognise that you're not medical experts, but recognise when to direct them to the professional support teams that are out there. There is a lot out there, and as we've seen in the press, recently, and with the pandemic, mental health is high on the agenda, and it's about trying to not make it be a stigma and try and help people. So hopefully you'll find those useful links useful. And what we'll do now is we're going to open up the lines to some questions. We've got a few minutes left before 11. So Sue, have we had any questions come in?
Oh yes. We've had quite a significant number of questions. So what we'll do, we'll answer a few of them now, and then we'll prepare a question and answer sheet, and we'll try and upload it with the link to a copy of the slides as well after the webinar. So hopefully that will help, because they're really good questions that are coming through, but we will not
Okay.
have time to cover all of them now, because some of them will take quite a bit of digging. So the first one, if I can ask you, is where you make reasonable adjustments, should you confirm this in writing?
Yes. So I would always keep, yeah, because essentially what you've got to think of, it might be not necessarily be a reality, but you've got to be prepared. What if you get questioned and challenged externally? You're going to need to be able to evidence it, potentially at a tribunal, basically, of your actions and why. So definitely document it. So there will be you know, when I've supported managers on managing absence cases, regardless of the absence reason, um, there's a follow-up letter after the meeting, whether it's been a welfare informal meeting or whether it's been a formal absence meeting. It just is important to just summarise key points from those conversations, which will include where you've put reasonable adjustments. And if you have been asked to put something in place but you don't think it's reasonable, so i.e. potential for a dispute, put that in as well to document and record your thought process as to why it's not reasonable.
Okay, thank you. So another good question, to what extent should absence management triggers be adjusted for those with mental health issues?
Absence triggers, it's really, really difficult, and it's going to be case by case. So let me just talk through how I've worked it before. So it's the principle's going to apply for any health condition, first of all. And the other thing I was going to just say is actually sometimes people think I'm going to ignore all mental health absences from my absence management and just invite them to a meeting when they trigger it on non-mental health. But that can get very tricky and challenging to manage. It's far better approach, in my personal opinion, to actually just make an adjustment to the trigger in itself. Now, when you work out what is a reasonable trigger, so your starting point, so every business, first of all, is going to have their own trigger system. So look at your company's own trigger system, then look at your employee's absence record, mainly over 12 months, but actually just to perhaps give some context, go back perhaps 2 years worth, get a feel for what their absences are like, and but certainly in that 12-month period, work out then of those which were attributed to their mental health, which were not. Think about any medical evidence you may have. You might have it or you might not, but if you do have it, look at what the report is saying in terms of potential for future absences, because that will potentially be one of the questions you ask of the medical professional. And so use that information, and also information from what the employee tells you in meetings. That in itself is evidence, if you like. And then it's working out what's reasonable to your business is going to be very different. Every business is going to be difficult, but take all that information and try and work out what would it look like if we allowed it to go from 5 occasions in 12 months. So if we increased it to 10 occasions in 12 months, what impact would we see on the business? Try and think from a business side as well what each scenario is, and try and just play around with different scenarios and try and get a feel for the impact business, but also the employee. But it's not easy.
No.
But if you can, and even if you identify a suitable adjustment but need to rejig it later down the line, perhaps that's not, you know, that's not an issue. You can do that, because you know you won't know until it's in practice. But I think certainly looking at your history is going to be key, and using medical evidence from a practitioner will also help. I don't know
Thank
whether
you.
you've got anything to add, Sue.
No, I agree
But it's
totally. And sort of linked with that, we've had another question around if the absences are related to a mental health condition that falls under the Equality Act, should they
yeah,
be recorded separately to general absences?
you don't want multiple systems in
No.
place. You want one absence management system, record all absences. Um, it no, you essentially want one place for all your absence information, store it all centrally and record it. Now, if you're going down the avenue of having adjusted absence triggers, then you don't need to record uh, equality related absences separately. It's all part and parcel of their absence management record. Obviously, through line managing the individual and supporting them in your conversations, when you look back over their record, so when you return to work meeting and you look back over how many absences they've had now over the last 12 months, that's where you can have that conversation to say, oh, I know you've had 3 occasions that were to do with it, but the rest aren't. Or, but yeah, essentially keep them in one place and don't do anything different just because of them, other than through how you manage your processes.
Yes, absolutely. And then again, sort of following on, if an individual won't accept they have a mental health issue and they won't engage in anything offered, such as EAPs, OH referrals, or seeing their GP, but their performance continues to be poor, I guess this will come down to how well your medical report clause in your contract's worded, because I know we use something that says if you fail to engage with the process, we'll have to make decisions based on the information we
Yeah,
have. So I guess it's a covering your back issue, isn't it? In a way, you need to document that you have offered all of this and giving them one last chance to engage with the process. Otherwise, you have to continue to manage it
yeah,
on what you have.
absolutely. Yeah, and you hope that people recognise and come to the decision themselves that they need help. You can't force it. Obviously, you've got your processes to invite them to participate in occupational health and things like that. But you know, you do want your employees to recognise it. But it is really difficult. And sometimes, like Sue says, you get to the point where you have to say, actually, I need to make a decision on the information that I do have, and you can't do any more than that.
And if that going on further with that, when somebody's mental health is affecting the team around them, their line manager, because they need so much support, it's kind of affecting the whole
Yeah,
department. I mean, again, you have to consider the business and everybody else's needs as well. And sometimes the line managers need their own EAP support if they're
yeah,
supporting a number of their staff with mental health issues, because it is quite draining and challenging and time consuming, but you feel you have to give the time to enable them to recover. And then you get the conflict of you're not, doing your own job because you're spending so much time supporting them.
yeah,
So you do need to address it and consider the business needs as well, which can affect how you manage that process. And it might be that they need more time
yeah.
away from the business, or you look at alternative roles maybe for a bit. I guess there's a lot.
Yeah.
Anything else you can think of on that one?
I was just going to add as well is if somebody says or declines access to occupational health or anything like that, and you're at the point of having to make decisions on the limited information you have, you can still revisit that conversation, and you should still revisit that conversation as you continue to manage absence. Just because they're saying they're not wanting to participate now, they might revisit it because they might change their mind. So
Yeah,
that's what I was going
absolutely.
to say.
Yeah, yeah. And then we've got the challenge of presenteeism. So those that return to work only because their sick pay's run out, even though they're not really ready to return. So
Yeah.
that's another challenge in itself that you need to manage, isn't it? So yeah. Okay, I think we have got quite a lot more questions. In fact, a lot more questions, probably be another hour or so. But we will respond to them all, but we'll do them in the form of a question and answer, because I think they'll probably be quite interesting for all of you. So we'll work on those for you and get them hopefully out in time to upload with the link to the slides.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Victoria.
That's
So
okay.
if I just move on, we've got one final poll for you, really, because we do run training on mental health first aiders, on various other health and safety support, and have partners we work with for EAP schemes, and other sort of training. So if you are interested in us following up with you afterwards with any support, it was just so you can indicate here. I think it's distributing the poll. Then just let us know, and we will contact you to discuss all the options further. We do both customised and delegated training as well. Okay, I think most people. No, there's quite a splurge coming in now. Okay, thank you. I'll close that now. So just to let you know, our future webinars, the ones we've already got scheduled, which are managing your cybersecurity, which is coming up next week. We've got health and safety at work, general fire safety one, and we've got a data and GDPR, all very popular webinars. We've got a significant number of registrations for all of them as well. But hot off the press, I'm pleased to confirm, we have a new program that we're about to post. So we're looking at employing people, 10 things you need to get right, another in our SME series. We're looking at how to deal with bullying and harassment, and also a big one that we're doing is a HR and health and safety combined webinar in May on returning to work after lockdown. So we'll look at both the practical health and safety things you can consider, as well as the HR side. We're expecting a significant number on that one as well. So these will be posted after this webinar, and you'll be able to register. We've also got some on how serious allegations can be handled safely, looking at protected or without prejudice conversations, and remote working, how you can manage performance, as we anticipate that a lot more people will be wanting to work from home even once the restrictions are lifted. These have come, a lot of the topics have come from requests from these webinars when we've posted, what would you like to see? So as always, please give us your feedback if there's any other topics you would like us to cover while we work on the programme from August onwards. We will also be slotting some more ad hoc ones in as needed, as the government decide to change what they're offering, and other things that come up during the next few months. So as I mentioned earlier, we do a first aiders for mental health qualification course, and we are looking at awareness courses as well in mental health. We have an employee assistance program as well that we can discuss with you. As always, if you wish to stay in the loop in what's going on from an HR and a health and safety perspective, then do sign up for our newsletter. Any further questions or any feedback, please do let us know. These are the contacts. And it remains for me to just say thank you. Thank you to Victoria for a very interesting and informative topic. And thank you to you all for attending. And we look forward to joining you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.